The most dangerous woman in Christendom entered the world in the shadow of her father's throne. Isabella of France, born around 1295, was no ordinary princess. Her veins carried the blood of conquerors. Through her father, Philip IV, known as the Fair because of his strikingly handsome appearance, she was descended from William the Conqueror, and through her mother, Joan of Navarre, she inherited the fiery spirit of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Isabella grew up primarily in the court of Louvre Palace, where she received the best education and conversed with some of the greatest minds of her day. She was said to have been highly intelligent, a gift she made good use of her entire life. When diplomats first inspected the 6-year-old Isabella as a prospective bride for England's heir, they saw a delicate child with eyes like polished flint. A Venetian ambassador noted, "The girl watches and learns," a foreshadowing of her strategy years in the future. Yet at the time, nobody recognized her true potential beneath the silks and furs of an overindulged royal child. Welcome to Storyteller's Hearth Fireside Tales, 3-episode production of Isabella the She-Wolf of France. Please don't forget to like, share, and, if you would like to see similar stories to this, subscribe to our channel. The soaring arches of Boulogne Cathedral should have framed the most glorious wedding of the age. 12-year-old Isabella, a vision in French splendor, radiantly entered the cathedral and proceeded down the aisle toward the altar in a gown of deep sapphire velvet covering her light auburn hair, its fitted French sleeves shimmering with gold thread and seed pearls complementing her delicate facial features with a composed expression. The weight of her ermine-trimmed cloak rested lightly on her slender shoulders and was fastened with a ruby brooch that caught the candlelight like a warning flare. Waiting for her at the altar stood her bridegroom, Edward of Carnarvon, King of England, golden-haired and towering over most other men in the cathedral. At 6 feet tall, his frame bore the marks of a prince raised on hunting, swimming, thatching roofs, building stone walls, and even the peculiar hobby of ditch digging. He was a king who was berated by the chroniclers for prizing low-born activities over noble pursuits such as jousting, which he viewed as encouraging gatherings of over-ambitious rivals, while being an unnecessary risk to his personal well-being. But as Isabella approached, she lifted her strikingly green eyes to meet his, only to glimpse Edward's gaze darting past her, seeking instead the reassurance of the smirking, smug face of Piers Gaveston. Piers, a Gascon knight, stood in the highest place of honor among all the nobles, basking in the king's attention. He had been Edward's childhood companion, and now he called him brother. Chroniclers would later sneer at Gaveston's tavern brawler's swagger and his love for theatrics, flamboyant costumes, biting mockery, and a crass arrogance that irritated everyone else to the core. The author of the Vita Edwardi Secundi, a contemporary chronicler, said he was a man who knew how to play the game of tyranny. Nearly all contemporary accounts agree that Piers Gaveston was a strikingly handsome man, with chroniclers praising him for his grace, agility, sharp wit, and refined manners. His extravagant clothing and lavish lifestyle became legendary, earning both admiration and disdain. The Vita Edwardi Secundi mocked his outrageous pomp and vainglory, yet his skill as a jouster and warrior first caught the attention of King Edward I. Even hostile chroniclers admitted his wit made him entertaining, but his mockery of the nobility fueled their hatred, ensuring his presence was as provocative as it was captivating. Indeed, England now had 2 kings, one crowned, the other an upstart clad in stolen valor. Edward had gifted Gaveston the Earlship of Cornwall, a prestigious title usually reserved only for royal princes, and the knight wore it like a jester's cap, jeering as he doled out cruel nicknames to the realm's most powerful men. The barons' fury simmered, their fists tightening around sword hilts as Gaveston smirked through the vows. Isabella, her small hands folded over her jeweled girdle, noticed everything. The way the Archbishop's blessing seemed to fade into thin air, the way her own father, Philip IV of France, watched with a gaze as cutting as a drawn blade. This was no ordinary marriage, it was a powder keg, and Gaveston was the spark. Geoffrey of Paris recorded the moment. When the king should have kissed his 5 feet 4 inches tall bride, he clasped Gaveston's hand instead. The French delegation was so outraged by Edward's display of what they perceived as contempt for his French bride. They eventually stomped out of the celebrations. But the child queen, ever the diplomat, and old for her years, pretended not to notice. The insults against Isabella soon became routine, irking the sensibilities of both nobility and chroniclers alike. Within weeks, Edward gifted her wedding jewels to Gaveston, who mockingly flaunted them at court in the Queen's presence. Isabella's coronation at Westminster Abbey 1 month later, mirroring their wedding, was a glittering shower of overt insults directed at the young Queen. The chroniclers described the situation as the king loving what he should have hated and hating what he should have loved. By the time Isabella turned 13, the glittering promises of her wedding had curdled into quiet despair. The bedchambers of her English palaces stood cold and untouched, not by the absence of a husband, but by his deliberate disdain. Edward, who should have been her companion, her protector, her king, instead treated her as a ghost in her own court. She felt as if she were invisible. Where in France she had conversed with the court as an equal, she was now relegated to irrelevance. With trembling fingers, the young queen penned a letter to her father, Philip IV of France, the Iron King, whose very name made monarchs tremble. She wrote of Edward's abandonment, of her nights spent alone while her husband revelled with Piers Gaveston, who he described as his second self. She confessed to her father the humiliations, the way Edward's eyes avoided hers in council, the way Gaveston's insolence left no room for a queen's voice. The chroniclers, ever merciless, etched her sorrow into history. The Vita Edwardi Secundi scoffed, the king loves Gaveston as a second self, while the queen is but a shadow on the wall. When word of Edward's behaviour reached Paris, Philip's fury was evident to all within his palace. He viewed Edward and Gaveston's conduct as an insult not just to Isabella, but to the very dignity of France and its king. French chronicles like the Chronique Métrique wrote of Gaveston as a stain on the fleur-de-lis. But Isabella, despite her youth, already understood the cruel truth. Letters could move kings, but they could not make a husband love his wife. The Great Hall of Westminster buzzed with tension in the spring of 1308. The barons, their patience frayed to the breaking point, had enough and decided to force the king's hand with threats of rebelling. At his coronation, Edward had sworn to grant and keep his oath, to confirm the laws and customs given to them by the previous just and God-fearing kings, his ancestors, and especially the laws, customs, and liberties granted to the clergy and people by the glorious king, St. Edward, his predecessor. He promised to cause justice to be rendered rightly, impartially, and wisely, in compassion and in truth, and to hold and observe the just laws and customs that the community of his realm would determine. And now, like his father, he had so quickly broken his promises. As a result of this pressure from the English barons, Piers was declared an enemy of the realm, and Edward II, his face masking his fury, was given no choice but to send his beloved friend into exile across the Irish Sea and revoke his title of Earl of Cornwall. For Queen Isabella, at just 13 years old and fresh from the glittering courts of France, it should have been a moment of relief. With Gaveston gone, the murmurs at court grew quieter. The barons, pacified for now, turned their attention elsewhere. No longer did she have to endure the humiliation of watching Gaveston flaunt his stolen royal titles of the Earl of Cornwall and Regent of England, while she, the Queen, was treated as an extraneous afterthought. Yet the peace was hollow. Though Gaveston was exiled in Ireland, his ghost lingered in every corner of Edward's world. The king wrote to him constantly, his letters full of aching longing. He perpetually schemed for Gaveston's return, bribing barons with gifts of land, begging the Pope. His every thought was bent on reversing the exile. Isabella, though no longer forced to share her husband's attention, still found herself alone, overshadowed by a man who wasn't even there. And then, in the summer of 1309, the fragile calm was shattered. Gaveston returned and brought with him chaos. Edward triumphantly welcomed him back with open arms. The barons' glares returned, sharper than ever. The court, so briefly free of scandal, braced itself once more. The king had chosen his favorite over his kingdom, and Isabella, still so young, could only watch as the storm clouds of discontent gathered anew. The respite had lasted barely a year, and now the worst was yet to come. Isabella of France, a direct descendant of both the Saxon king, Harold Godwinson, and his Norman conqueror, was now barely 14 years old, as she carried the weight of 2 kingdoms on her slight shoulders. She was scarcely acknowledged by everyone except her French attendants, as she quietly moved through the court. Not only was she ignored by the king and his confidant, but the English nobles also distrusted her, suspecting her of being a French mole and a possible Gaveston informant. Around her, England's nobility raged. The Earls of Lancaster, Warwick, and Hereford, men who traced their bloodlines back to kings and men of valor, ground their teeth at the mere sight of Piers Gaveston, lounging in privileges that were rightly theirs. This upstart Gascon, this king's shadow, who wore his titles like a stolen crown, conceitedly doling out royal favors as he thought fit, confident in his king's approval. What irritated them most was the manner in which he disrespectfully mocked their ancient families right to their faces. Gaveston had dared to nickname the hero of the Battle of Falkirk, Guy de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, the Black Dog of Arden. Since in the Middle Ages, black dogs represented omens of death, and the Forest of Arden was a large woodland on the Earl's estates, the nickname was viewed by the Earl as being highly insolent. Isabella, raised in the splendor of the French court, understood well the danger of her position. She was no fool, even at 14. While Edward doted on his beloved Gaveston with a devotion that bordered on an obsession, she, in taking a calculated risk, attempted to befriend the man who was making England's elite hate its king. Without her invoking the wrath of the barons, she knew it was walking on a razor's edge. To the barons, she was merely the French trophy bride, a child with no power. To Edward, she was an irritating political necessity, but not a partner, and to Gaveston, she was just another annoyance whose influence with the king must be degraded. But Isabella watched and learned. She saw how Gaveston's arrogance fanned the flames of rebellion, how Edward's blind love for the intolerable upstart made the king weak in the eyes of his lords, how the undertones of discontent grew louder with each passing day. Thank you for watching Isabella the She-Wolf of France. This concludes Episode 1, Isabella's Humiliation. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to help us increase our coverage. Next in Episode 2, Isabella's Revenge coming soon. The English nobles, led by Thomas of Lancaster and Guy Beauchamp, force King Edward to accept the new ordinances, 41 articles stripping him of his power and exiling his favorite, Piers Gaveston, under the threat of death. Edward reluctantly agrees, but is devastated when Gaveston, after defiantly returning, is captured and executed without any real trial, deepening the royal instability. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella continues to endure Edward's neglect as Hugh Despencer the Younger usurps her influence, seizes her lands, and reduces her to poverty. As a result of Edward's atrocious abandonment of her during her perilous escape from Scottish invaders, Isabella begins to live a more independent life outside the court, her loyalty and respect for the king having been completely shattered. After she and her son are sent to negotiate on King Edward's behalf in France, she refuses to return with the prince unless Edward dismisses dispenser. But when Edward declines, she seizes the opportunity to raise an army and vows to reclaim England as its conqueror. Don't miss episode 2, coming soon.